Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
So, today we're going to be talking about...
Lying.
That's right.
And is there any of that going on in the collective? Virtually, as we speak, it seems like it's everywhere.
It's a big, big topic. Mm-hmm. So we can't turn on the television, listen to a podcast without something going on with Mueller's investigations and Manafort getting busted and...
Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels. One wonders, shall we call it a cover-up? Is that different from lying? Or is that just probably another way of referring to the same thing?
Mm-hmm. And that there is something in the human psyche, something in the human soul, that when we're under a certain amount of duress or fear, that we go to hiding and lying and gaslighting, misrepresenting. Trickstering. So now we're talking about the archetype of the trickster. So let's unpack that since we are a Jungian podcast. What about the trickster?
Well, we've talked a little bit about Brer Rabbit, the hero who always escapes by being a trickster. He lies, he gets out of trouble, he's a deceiver, and of course he is a hero.
And he's a survivor. Because, like rabbits in the natural world, they're vulnerable and they have to use certain instincts to be able to minimize or escape from danger.
Yes. Rabbits, like human beings, physically, do not have claws or beaks or other ways of defending themselves. So the rabbit is the trickster. He's smarter than Brer Fox, for example. And that's how he survives. And I believe it's a classic defense in fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the trickster plays a major role in many different mythological systems and is often associated sometimes with the supreme deity or with sort of the culture hero. You know, the crow is a Native American trickster who steals the sun.
What about coyote? Another Native American trickster.
So when we're talking about mythology and fairy tales, we're talking about the universality of the trickster.
Yes.
And the use of subterfuge to survive.
And it's not just survive, though, because I think one of the things about the trickster energy is it's usually in service to individuation. And do we want to just take a minute and sort of describe what individuation means to us as Jungians?
Yes, but especially translating the idea of the trickster in the realm of humanity. You know, for instance, a chameleon changes colors. But we don't know whether that's in service to an individuation. But in human beings, when we apply that...
Psychologically.
A psychological process, yeah.
I'm back on the images of these animals, of the rabbit, the coyote, and the crow. That those are images of the trickster of, for example, the horse is not a trickster image. A dog is not a trickster image. These are animals that are a little bit shadowy.
Well, and they're not identified with trickster behavior because they're not observed to be tricky in the natural environment the way a crow might be.
Yeah.
But I do want to circle back to something that Lisa said a second ago, which is the idea of trickster energy being in service to the idea of individuation, which then begs the definition of that.
Of individuation. So individuation was one of Jung's very big ideas. And it basically, well, he described it differently in different ways. He said it was the process of becoming an individual. But in a sense, I think that you could say that it is the lifelong process of psychological development whereby one brings into manifestation as much of one's potential as possible. So it's a process of making what is in potential manifest and conscious too, I would say. Did I do a good job there? You want to add anything?
I would add that it's an image of wholeness versus perfection, lest anyone think that it's becoming somehow gloriously wonderful necessarily.
Yes, right.
But it is fulfilling your innate potential, including the integration of what we call shadow material, our vulnerability, our dishonesty, our weakness, our greed, all those qualities that we want to say are not ours, that is a part of our wholeness, not necessarily to act upon, but to be aware of.
Mm-hmm. And even those descriptors of the qualities of potential wholeness, which we find negative, are really cultural commentaries on what is whole inside of us. I wanted to just step back and say that in order for individuation to be valid, there's a deeper presupposition that each human being has an intrinsic instinct towards who and what they really are.
Yes.
Which is something that comes with the soul, comes with the psyche into life, versus is imposed upon it.
Right. We come into the world with it. As
a blueprint.
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea is inherent in Jung, and it's developed more by Hillman.
Mm-hmm.
And I buy that. Works for me.
Absolutely. I mean, with the self, as Deb had said, as an archetype of wholeness, that there is this kind of mandala, there is this completeness that we have as human beings, and then we go through a socialization process, which gives us information about what aspects of that is going to be well received or punished in the environment, and then we begin to truncate our personalities, which, by the way, is an essential process, if not a painful process.
Mm-hmm. So wait. We started talking about lying. Why are we here? How can we bring this back?
So bringing this full circle, how is lying in service to protecting one's wholeness
That's a good way to put
time to time? Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I want to just kind of ground this in, maybe biology a little bit, is that primatologists have looked at behavior, for example, in troops of chimpanzees, and found that the more successful individuals were better at dissembling. And, that is also true, actually, for crows, because ornithologists have studied corvid behavior and found that crows are very tricky about purposefully hiding their food. It's called caching. And they will pretend to cache food in a place that they're not actually caching food if they know they're being watched by another crow.
Very tricky.
So we know that it is literally adaptive in the evolutionary sense, that hiding, lying, dissembling can pay off in terms of survival of an individual or a species.
Well, but there's a difference between doing that and being selfish, is there not? And individuation. They are two different things, and perhaps not in the animal world. And I can see the overlap of survival and succeeding, dominance and power and all the rest of it, whether in humans or chimpanzees. But would we say that that's individuation? That every time somebody is selfish or the crow is successful?
But I think that so being tricky, lying, hiding, sneaking, it's always a transgression, right? And we know that individuation often involves transgressions. It means breaking the rules a little bit. And in particular, I think that trickster behavior can be important in individuation when we have a choice between following the prescribed rules of the tribe versus stretching into a place that we feel that we need to grow because of the call of individuation.
I think a good example of that in terms of movies, if any of you remember Yentl.
I don't.
That's okay. I know I'm dating myself. And Barbara Streisand plays this role. But it's an old story that they turned into a movie where Yentl is a young woman. She's the daughter of a scholar, and women are not allowed to study Torah. Mm-hmm. And so she garbs herself as a boy. She's able to trick herself to get herself into a yeshiva. Mm-hmm. And she goes through a profound scholarly training as a rabbinical scholar that would not have been allowed, that her need for a vibrant intellectual life required her to be tricky.
To lie. Yeah, that's a great example. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. And obviously it raises an ethical issue.
Right. It's considered a huge transgression in that culture.
Yes.
Well, I think we're talking about a couple of different things. One is, does one transgress cultural norms, cultural values of that women, for example, could not study Torah, or the crow is supposed to share its goodies with other crows, other members of the flock, and doesn't. And is that the same thing as a deceit that is simply selfish and venal?
Well,
That's an internal violation versus just I'm not conforming with the cultural values.
So it's sort of like, is the lie in service to
Yes.
ego ends, or in service to something larger?
Yes.
And that is, this is a question that requires a process of discernment. And of course, a lot of times we might be doing it for, as you put it, venal ends, and we can convince ourselves, we can justify, we can lie to ourselves and say, that's an interesting topic about lying to ourselves, because I think we all do that a lot.
Right. And undoubtedly, the lying to oneself in the misrepresentation is often in service to reducing the anxiety that we feel when we are actually in conflict with the culture or we're frightened about repercussions. And there's something very real and present about that.
And that we want to preserve our own good opinion of ourselves.
That's right.
We want to protect, in Jungian terms, our persona, and can be identified with our status or our looks or appearing to be particularly heroic, good, kind, etc. And that we don't want to have to face the fact that perhaps we're not as good, as wise, as brave, as competent as we would like to believe we are.
So this idea of misrepresenting ourselves outwardly, but also misrepresenting ourselves inwardly.
Becoming persona identified with our very, perceived positive qualities and denying the negative ones. So it's not just we're identified with ego, and we can be identified with persona, and it all adds up to self-deception and loss of consciousness, a loss of awareness.
So I have a little personal story about that. So when I was in graduate school, I went to a graduate school in Manhattan, and I was living in Brooklyn. And there was this, subway that was a real sort of straight shot. And I would be 10 minutes late for every class. And I never really thought about it until one day I got curious about it. And I noted that I was never late to meet a friend, but I would be 10 minutes late to every single class in graduate school. And I used to tell myself that here's what would happen. I would leave my apartment at such and such a time. I would arrive on the subway platform and I would curse the subway because there wasn't a train waiting for me.
Makes perfect sense.
Exactly. And then I would tell myself the whole way there that I was going to be late and it was the fault of the subway.
There you go.
It's really very funny. And then I realized that I was lying to myself, that I was simply not leaving my apartment on time, and then of course I had to budget time to wait for the subway. I mean, it was so humbling, and once I admitted that to myself, that I really just wanted to sit and have a cup of coffee for 10 more minutes, I wasn't late again.
Right, because then it put the decision in your conscious hands instead of into the complex or whatever else that was making a decision for you.
I think the other subterfuge there was I wouldn't want to be late to meet a friend somewhere because I felt like an obligation to that person, an interpersonal obligation. I told myself it didn't matter if I was late for class. I mean, I didn't consciously say that to myself, but that I was operating on that assumption that, oh, well. And then I thought, well, it's rude. It's disruptive. Come on, kid, grow up.
Well, but I think you're putting on something, putting a clarity on something that's very important, that there's something about tricky behavior which denies empathy.
Yeah.
That we can't be tricky and deeply empathically in tuned around the impact of our tricky behavior.
Because something is split off.
Right. So with the friend, where you could imagine how the friend might look or feel to be left waiting for 10 minutes or being concerned about you because you're not there, that empathic attunement motivated you. But I think tricky behavior is founded on this kind of collapse of empathy, particularly towards the one who is being tricked.
That's interesting.
And I could see that, imagine anyway, that having a sense of impact on a friend, that I don't want to affect this friend and make him or her worry or be rude and not keep my word, versus the impact on a class. And let's say that it's a big lecture class of 150 people or something. So who cares if I'm there or not there? I don't have to be on time. But there's a principle that requires something other than empathy, that there is a principle, a contract that I'm going to do this program, doors open and close. It does have an effect on people. There's a principle around lateness, promptness, and kind of fulfilling my obligation as student to be in class on time. It's a little more distant from the impact on me, as it were, of my friend has been worried about me. I feel guilty.
Well, it's easier to lie to myself about.
Yeah.
I think that was the thing. And of course, on the other side, and here's this question about when might it be in service to something, I was claiming something for myself that I wanted to sit and have a cup of coffee. However, I was not claiming it consciously. It is an unconscious, tricky, lying, hiding behavior I think of it as unconscious entitlement. And the thing about unconscious entitlement is it's often where a sense of integrated conscious entitlement can begin.
I was thinking about Brer Rabbit, who is conscious and tricky. And I'm going back to your example of being late for class, that there's a difference between a felt connection with a person and sort of the principle of law or that is a little bit different. And I'm linking that maybe to all the stuff that's in the press with Paul Manafort and Stormy Daniels and all the rest of it, of that there is a principle here that has been, or a set of principles, lots of them, that have been violated of who's it going to hurt if I cover this up? Who's it going to hurt about dealings with various Russians and political stuff and denials? Who's it going to hurt if no one knows? If no one notices? Just like you, who's it going to hurt if you're 10 minutes late to class? That is a very different thing from, this will have an impact on my friend that I'm going to see in the coffee shop.
And I think that this linking of the impulse to be dishonest or acting dishonestly and the potential damage that it can cause is kind of what's happening with the Mueller investigation. So you could imagine one of Trump's sons perhaps having this secret conversation with Russian operatives, shifting money, shifting power around, and this dopey kid, if we want to be generous, having no sense of foresight, having no sense of larger impact, perhaps feeling like it's some kind of a game or even exciting. And then as the investigation unfolds, the reality that this actually has an enormous impact on national security, on any number of other levels, and inappropriate and frightening peddling of influence and the autonomy of the United States. And those levels of impact are probably not being consciously held, which then makes it seem easier to take the risk, easier to muck around in this realm of integrity.
So again, maybe there's some, in order to do something like that, you have to kind of lie to yourself, presumably, unless you're, perhaps not if you really have traits of sociopathy, but that many of us do things that are less than 100% stand up when we manage to lie to ourselves about it first. I can certainly relate to that.
And that is a very dangerous deception, is
Yes,
it not?
it is.
I mean, your story about graduate school is so apropos because it made all the difference in the world when you realized you were lying to yourself,
Yeah.
and it would shift it altogether if you made a conscious decision to take another 10 minutes, have my coffee, and take my chances with the subway being right there for me or not. But today I have to have another 10 minutes
Yeah,
for myself.
it would have been totally different.
Yes.
It would have been totally different.
And one wonders with the Mueller investigation, Manafort, Stormy Daniels, there's a whole long list. How consciously are these decisions being made about deception? I think not very consciously.
And I think that's where there's a certain, in the public dimension, there's a certain sector of society that seems protective of these people who are being caught and confronted. Because there's this, sometimes this perception of innocent deception or stupid deception, accidental deception. I'm not sure that that's true.
Still not conscious.
Still not conscious. And so people can empathically identify with their own unconscious impulse to deceive.
And I imagine that some of the circles that people in power occupy have a very different ethical standard, that there are, we've talked about cultural differences of what's okay and what's not okay to adjust to societal demands. And I think that some of these, this is a whole different realm, a societal realm of what is okay, what is ethical, what's allowed, what's not allowed. And it feels a little bit like playing fast and loose.
Well, and both political parties have been engaged in that. I think you could link that kind of ability to become loosed from your moral foundation to the inflation that comes with being in power, and that then it feels more easy to lie to yourself and justify such things. And that's, that certainly happened in previous democratic
and I also think that
administrations as
historically that it has to do with the shift from kingships to constitutional democracies.
Yes.
That what was the world like when you had these idiosyncratic decisions that were being made by incredibly powerful individuals versus having a rule of law and expecting that people who the culture assigns tremendous power to must abide by a set of rules, because we know historically how horrifying it can be when power is given to people who make decisions based on their complexes, based on their neurotic impulses.
And that there's no check on those, because you can certainly do that and be elected. It's you don't just have to be a dictator to make decisions from your complexes, but at least hopefully in our system there's a workable series of checks on foolish decisions.
And underlying that, the principle of law, that there is an undergirding set of principles that we have all tacitly agreed to abide by. And when they are overthrown, we do, in effect, go back to divine right, that because this person is in power or has greater wisdom, he or she thinks, is inflated, as you said, Lisa, that then it becomes personal. And that's very dangerous.
And this rule of law or these ethical principles exist to force us to be more conscious, to force us to consider things that we would not instinctively consider, and thereby expand awareness. Now, and this idea that we were talking about before of becoming more aware about our unconscious decisions or our unconscious impulses is at the basis of what it means to be in analysis. That, and Freud, I think, brought this forward so beautifully, that one of the primary roles of analysis is to adapt to reality. And what I like to tell my clients and tell myself, as painful as it is that reality is medicinal, even if it's shocking, painful, horrifying, frightening. And once we adapt to it, then we have choices, and choices that can make a difference.
Oh, I really like that. It's about sort of the sense of taking responsibility, and you can't do that until you're dealing with reality.
Becoming conscious.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like we're at a good place to transition into our dream section, and Lisa has an amazing dream for us to look at.
Okay, the dreamer is male, and he's 33 years old, and this is the dream. I had a dream a couple of days ago where I was cut in half by a shaman. The setting of this dream occurred in my backyard. The shaman was Aztec, it seemed. At the same time, I was a shaman too, who was willing to be sacrificed by this shaman. He cut me in half with a ceremony knife, and as he cut, snakes came out of my body. An extension of this dream was of a snake crawling up my spine to talk to me. I don't remember what it said. Oh my gosh, this is such a huge dream.
Where to start?
I know.
Oh my gosh.
So just as an aside, a huge dream or a big dream is actually a category of dreams that Jungians talk about, where it seems like there is a powerful, impersonal, archetypal or spiritual dimension to the dream that really transcends.
It's not an everyday dream.
It's not an everyday
dream. It seems to
dream.
point that there is something big, big, big going on in the psyche of this individual.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is not only related to personal experience. It taps into a mythological realm, and we see that right away. There's shamans and ceremony knives being cut and snakes.
Well, and just the phenomena of being cut in half, and he's cut in half and is watching the process and commenting on it.
Which is actually very much like a shamanic initiation. I mean, I'm curious how much the streamer knows about shamanic initiations, because this is very similar to the kind of hypnagogic experience that shamans have when they're going through their initial shamanic initiation.
Yes, I think the theme is dismemberment. The power animal or some other visionary figure will often eat the initiate or dismember them in some way, and then they'll be put back together in a new fashion and, in a sense, be a new person.
And, it feels like I want to just share the context of the dream. So this is what the dreamer says. I'm reading the dreamer's words here. At the time, there was a conflict with a woman I am interested in. It was really a stressful time for me, and I felt like I was being torn apart. And it says that he dealt with it by doing art.
So this translating of his personal suffering into this expressive, artistic, perhaps symbolic way.
Yes.
So what's unique about shaman versus other kinds of spiritual initiators? What do you think?
It's very individual.
It's very personal.
I'm afraid I know very little about shamans except the three realms of above and below, and some kind of altered state that the shaman experiences to traverse the three realms above and below, and I guess the here and now.
Well, I think that what I was thinking is shamans are often recognized that they are not really self-chosen, that the shaman often has gone through some kind of a tremendous trauma, perhaps has even appeared to have died from an illness or an injury and survived it, that in some way they have gone to the other side and come back, and that the experience marks them as a shaman versus, let's say, a Catholic priest who declares that they're going to go through a training process and become a priest.
So the calling for it bubbles up from the unconscious, we might say.
The calling, or they're claimed, really. It seems like
right.
it's an external claiming of them by fate in some ways.
And there's this idea of the sort of creative illness that Ellenberger talks about that's kind of mapped on the shamanic illness, that it's falling into the night sea journey that marks you as being called to this.
So there's a psychological correlate of a level of suffering that is almost like dying. And that if we can come back from it, we are a different order of being.
Right.
And can speak to that
and
in a way.
And can heal others.
And can heal others.
And you said it's almost like dying. It certainly is dismembering.
So would we consider Freud and Jung as having had this kind of experience? Freud talked about having had a creative illness, and Jung had a period of 6 years where he had what he called his encounter with the unconscious, a kind of shamanic creative illness.
And I think that when people have a very direct encounter with the unconscious, there is a an overwhelming quality, this feeling that the ego must accommodate what's rising up and cannot master it, or at least master it with any immediacy.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we think about any of this in response to this particular dreamer and his dream?
Well, we might, or I might imagine, that the shaman is an image of the self,
Yes.
of this greater part of his personality, which is determined that the waking personality, the ego, will undergo a profound transformation.
Mm-hmm.
It may have been triggered through this romantic conflict, but it also may have happened for other reasons that are also deeper.
And I kind of prognostically, I feel like it's really positive that the dreamer was willing to be sacrificed
Yes.
by this shaman. The ego is not fighting whatever this is. And in fact, we always ask for the key emotions in the dream. And this dreamer answered, I was surprisingly calm. He was willing to surrender.
Yes, to this process.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's a ceremonial knife.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some quality of consciousness that this is part of a larger transformative impulse in the psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And sacrifice is such a huge symbol and archetypal image. But generally, does it seem to you true to say that when one sacrifices, there is this, not only the surrender, but in a way an expectation of to something greater or in the service of something greater?
Well, and sacrifice the etymology of that is to make sacred. So yes, it can only be a sacrifice if it is in service to something greater.
Yeah. And the dream ego seems to sense that.
Yes.
Hence the willingness, after which snakes come out of the dreamer's body. Mm-hmm. And one of them crawls up his spine to talk to him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the crawling up the spine of the snake is classic.
Joseph, tell us about that. I knew you were going to go
classic
for that.
Kundalini symbolism. That there is
Say more.
kind of part physical, part spiritual energy in that system, which is said to be lodged in the sacrum.
Mm-hmm.
And that through spiritual practices, although sometimes even through accidents, there can be a release of this force that rises up the spine, has some powerful effect on the endocrine system, and it literally changes brain function so that people experience extraordinary states of consciousness, which are frightening and hopefully ultimately integrative. So Jung was interested in Kundalini phenomena as well. He did a bit of writing, a bit of lecturing about it. And he was interested in bringing a psychological perspective to this kind of radical shifts and expansions of consciousness. So we don't know this dreamer, but as a prognostication, I would be wondering and watching if he is either in or about to enter into some kind of a radical shift of being.
So I'm just going to ask you to back up for a second. And can you talk about, what Kundalini is and why this dream made you think about it?
I think that the idea that a snake is released in the body, that the snake is crawling up the spine, and that this snake is talking to him, that there's a quality of consciousness to the process. All of that is very congruent with the Hindu and yogic writings and practices around Kundalini yoga.
So say more about Kundalini yoga, just in case some of our listeners aren't familiar with it.
Sure, just to unpack that a little bit. So Kundalini yoga is a complicated series of practices that is specifically designed to stimulate and awaken this latent force. And the metaphor that's often used is that the Kundalini is like a sleeping cobra, and the Kundalini practice is a small stick that's poked at the cobra. And the cobra, particularly among other forms of serpents, rises upward and arcs its hood at the top. And so in the image of the Kundalini rising up the spine, it is said to then arc into the pineal gland and activate the brain in a particular fashion. And this mobilization of force is said to stimulate all kinds of visionary experiences, which I can imagine Jung was interested in, even from the standpoint of describing himself and the visionary experiences he might have been having, and also to reassure people that extraordinary states of consciousness at times are not a form of mental illness, but a form of tremendous rapid transformation.
I just want to say, I have worked with other people who had dreams of snakes crawling up their spine. So it does appear to be this deeply embodied archetypal image. And it always had a kind of similar feel of some kind of opening up of the gateways of imagination or something.
And there's something sobering about it as well. I think big dreams in general that have strong archetypal images and themes, and in this kind of death and resurrection dream also, because he's cut in half, which is a deadly
he's
event.
Being sacrificed.
Right.
Something is being lost.
Absolutely. And the anticipation is that he would survive it, that there's something sobering as we imagine what might be before this dreamer. What is going to be happening in the analysis and in their lives in order to accommodate a change of that magnitude. And I think Jung certainly felt sober and cautious when people brought in dreams like this.
Yes. Yeah, certainly if I were working with this person and this dream came in early, I would have a sense of caution. It could be the beginning of, as you were saying, a major change process that could be very initiatory, or it could be something more concerning. I'm certainly not making any kind of statement about this particular dream, just how I might respond to it if it came into my practice.
Yes, I agree.
I'd like to offer now to back away a little bit from the archetypal level and make it just a little bit more emotional. So I'm just thinking about a young man who's having a love affair that is perhaps failing in some fashion, and the tremendous amount of anxiety and despair that a young person might be feeling around the loss of love, and the metaphor of feeling that that one has been cut open, and that these kind of snakes of anxiety, these snakes of abandonment and uncertainty are writhing through the body.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think we the dreamer says he was surprisingly calm
In the dream. Which could compensate for the amount of distress that he might have been feeling.
Yeah, he did say, in his waking life, he felt like he were being torn in half.
Right.
I'm thinking about the multiplicity of snakes coming out of a body of a kind of instinctual energy that is diffuse because there are many. And the contrast between that and a single snake in this Kundalini image crawling up the spine to talk to him. And I think this is one of the difficulties with trying to circumambulate a single dream from a dreamer that we don't know. Something big at the kind of imagistic, mythological, archetypal level is happening. And what we can't know is more about this dreamer, more about his situation, and what this dream, what the telos or the development, the future might be for the dreamer. What's being implied? Is something coming apart? Has something come together in a new way? Is it a lot about anxiety, as you kind of hinted at, Joseph? And there's a lot of don't know around this.
Sure.
And it is a big dream.
So, Jung spent a lot of time talking about what snakes might mean. And one of the things that he thought is that it's really sort of the instinctual life of the body. And that when snakes show up in a dream, it can mean that somehow we're not in touch with that, or we're trying to sort of step over that. So I wonder, here these snakes are coming out of his body. Sort of, is that the instinctual life asserting itself?
Well, I'm thinking about the polarity between instinctual life and spiritual life.
Yes. Say more about that.
Well, that their snakes are grounded. They don't have feet. They slither around on the ground. So there's a primal, grounded, basic, instinctual kind of energy to snakes. And then there's the spiritual dimension. Snakes shed their skin, so they get reborn, as it were. And there is the Kundalini image, which is ancient, of the snake that goes up the spine and something gets awakened in the brain, in consciousness.
And the sort of maybe a Western parallel to that is in this, I believe it's a Grimm's fairy tale. It's called The White Snake. And what happens it's a beautiful fairy tale. What happens in that tale is a young man who, I believe he is the servant of the king, and the king asks to eat the white snake, and the young man takes a bite. And it gives him the ability to understand the language of the animals.
So it opens up that capacity to relate to the instinctive. And coming back to the dream, that the snake is talking to him.
Yes.
That there is this language that's being revealed in the dream.
So what we could say is, look what an experience this dreamer has had.
Yeah.
This is what has happened to him. This shamanic experience, the sacrifice, the being cut in half, a snake coming up his spine. This is what has happened to you.
Yeah. Jung said that a dream is a snapshot of something that has already happened in the unconscious.
And so I would wish for this dreamer that he hold this dream as an experience, a life experience that he has had, and see for himself where it goes. What might that snake say? He says he doesn't remember what it said. Well, is there going to be another chapter? How is this going to unfold? But to honor the experience that he's had in this incredible dream. It's a memory. It's an experience.
It is that. I'd like to offer one more dimension if we have time. There's something also particularly biblical about the dream. So for Adam to be alone in the garden, and for a rib to be cleaved from his body to make his mate, and the dreamer is cleaved into, and for that then to lead to a talking serpent, as it does in Genesis, which then signals the end of paradise, and the shift into this earning your bread through the sweat of your brow and a life of suffering.
Well, and consciousness.
And consciousness. So we could circle this back to this loss of the affair with his girlfriend as a loss of paradise. This cleaving, this wisdom and suffering as a form of initiation. And rather than using a biblical image, using a shamanic image, which the psyche might find more comfortable, it does speak of this loss of paradise, which is essential as well as excruciating.
Yes, that's really very nice, that it is a fall.
A fall.
A fall from idealization, a fall from true love, a fall from what he may have believed about love and what it was like and how it works.
And that also is part of the path and the initiation into adulthood.
Yes.
That we don't fall in love at 30 the way we did at 16.
Yes.
If it's okay, I want to jump to a different symbol system for just a minute.
Yeah, I'm interested.
Because he mentions Aztec. And there is an Aztec serpent god, and that's Quetzalcoatl, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I think so.
And it's the feathered serpent, and that is the god of learning. So there's this idea of the serpent being associated with consciousness and wisdom.
And we're being flagged particularly to look at that Aztec, that definitive Aztec amplification. So I think that it's always very rich to look into many different cultures to find how, for instance, the image of the serpent is alive in Aztec mythology, in Judeo-Christian work, in Vedic and yogic work, and in other systems. And this leads us back to a core of Jung's discovery that there are these archetypal or universal patterns and images that inspire the consciousness of people over millennia and across the world. And lifting up our dream imagery to that universal level allows us to have a perspective and can alleviate a lot of anxiety around it, can allow us to...
Well, it can deepen the meaning.
And deepen the meaning as well.
We are part of something larger.
Yes.
It's very comforting to know that this dreamer is on a mythic river that has been shared over millennia in many different symbol systems and deeply human.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.